Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to start by saying that although it's my name on the programme today, this talk does represent the work of a whole team of people, 10 at its peak, who worked on the FeedSax project between 2017 and 2022 at various points. It was very much an interdisciplinary team led by Professor Helena Hamerow, and it spread between the universities of Oxford and Leicester, funded by the European Research Council, and drawing together expertise in settlement archaeology, archaeobotany, zooarchaeology, pollen studies, radiocarbon dating, and stable isotope analysis, as we'll see in due course. But first, and this is how we started planning the projects, let's take a step back and look at a dichotomy with which everyone here will be familiar, the distinction between the champion and the bosky, the planned and the ancient, a distinction observed for centuries, from at least John Leyland onwards, and rooted ultimately in agricultural landscapes of the Middle Ages. I think it's fair to say that the champion side has tended to receive the most attention. Landscapes characterised by expansive, more or less rectilinear patchworks of fields representing the enclosed, subdivided parcels of what were once the great open fields of medieval farming. The communally managed so-called Midland system, based around crop rotation, common grazing, and, at least in some areas, co-aeration with heavy mobile ploughs. As recurrent studies culminating in Robertson Rothmell's seminal Atlas of Rural Settlement have shown, these landscapes are, in general terms, characteristic of this central swathe of England. Its structural representation in the landscape and its modes of operation as a social and legal structure have been researched for well over a century now, with successive studies drawing upon essentially the same kinds of evidence: early modern maps, extant features in the landscape, field walking surveys, and medieval documents such as legal texts, charters, and so on. Despite the ingenuity and energy applied to this subject by so many brilliant scholars, we have in some ways reached an impasse, because the sources available are generally indirect evidence for agricultural practices, and because they are heavily biased towards the post-conquest period, we've been unable to attain a definitive, detailed, well-dated, direct and practical perspective on farming practices between roughly the 7th and 13th centuries that we've been looking at. In his landmark book, The Open Fields of England, in 2014, David Hall highlighted the need for better dating, among other things, writing that future research needs to proceed on various fronts, especially to refine the dating for the beginnings of extensive fields. Dating is required to discover how long before circa 850 they were abandoned, this latter point arising from his own interpretation of pottery scatters as an indication of widespread settlement desertion and potentially then the laying out of new field systems by the mid to late 9th century. And the problem in this context, of course, is that chronologies for Anglo-Saxon pottery can be as coarse as their fabric, and short of some marvel of rehydroxylation, they're unlikely to improve very much anytime soon. By contrast, organic paleoenvironmental remains, such as animal bones and plant remains, are readily datable by radiocarbon dating, which will attain greater accuracy with every newly published calibration curve. Indeed, Hall goes on to note the potential of paleo-environmental evidence to enhance our understanding of agricultural development in the early medieval period, observing in particular how many pollen sequences have been found to indicate an expansion of arable land from around the 7th or 8th century onwards. And this is where FeedSax comes in, to give the project its full name, Feeding Anglo-Saxon England, the Bioarchaeology of an Agricultural Revolution, with the term agricultural revolution placed firmly within scare quotes, because we have certainly not assumed from the outset that there was any single revolutionary moment of change from which sprang the Midland system or any other system for that matter. The bioarchaeology of the title encompasses a number of different kinds of evidence and a corresponding suite of scientific methodologies. Excuse me. From charred cereal grains and their accompanying weed seeds to the limbs to the limbs and mandibles of cattle and sheep, to pollen cores, from botanical survey and weed ecological study to radiocarbon dating to stable isotope analysis of bone collagen and cereal remains. And at the core of the FeedSax project design is the full integration of these methods and subdisciplines, so that the intention being in our main flagship publications, you won't find results divided firmly into separate sections for archaeobotany, zooarchaeology, and so on, but rather sections devoted to different elements of husbandry regimes. Because we have avoided the assumption that classic Midland system practices constituted a single discrete innovative package that was adopted or not adopted in different regions and periods, we've broken down this concept, what we've somewhat mischievously dubbed the mole ball plough package, into three distinct functional elements of medieval crop husbandry, which can be addressed using the materials and methods of bioarchaeology. Heavy mole ball ploughing, crop rotation, and extensive farming. Let's go through these elements each in turn to highlight some of our key findings. I certainly can't touch on everything. So the heavy mole ball plough, an innovative bit of kit that, unlike its lighter cousin, the yard or scratch plough, doesn't just score through the soil to break it up, but also churns it up, turns it over, upsetting many, though not all, weeds, aerating the tilth, improving drainage, nutrient absorption, and overall potentially opening up heavier soils to extensive cultivation. Artifactual and historical evidence indicates a long history of heavy ploughing in Anglo-Saxon and medieval England, at least in a high status context. From the 7th century iron coulter excavated at the Royal Vill at Lyminge in Kent, to the digging nose of the Exeter book riddle in the late 10th century, onto the vivid and well-known calendar illustrations of around the 11th century. But what such sources can't really elucidate are the geographical and chronological patterns in the uptake and spread of the mole ball plough. To get a fresh perspective on such patterns, we've used two main strands of analysis, one zooarchaeological and one archaeobotanical. And I should point out at this stage that despite our best efforts to get a good national coverage with bioarchaeological evidence, there are clear distributional biases in our data sets. So as you can see here, sites yielding Saxon and medieval charred plant remains and animal bones tend disproportionately to be well represented in southern and above all central England. So inevitably, our deductions and arguments apply chiefly to these regions. Is it on a timer? It's running on without me. So first, zooarchaeological analyses conducted by my colleague Matty Holmes, specifically the study of cattle limb bone pathologies, essentially arthritic malformations that develop when an ox or a cow is employed as a tractor. Witness the grisly progression here from unworked to overworked, but Matty has deployed a more subtle and sophisticated measure called the Modified Pathological Index, which is measured separately for hind and forelimbs. This graph tracks the incidence of Matty's Modified Pathological Index over time from the 5th to the 14th century. The dark blue line is for hind limbs, the red line for forelimbs. And the grey bars in the background stand for the number of specimens available for each window of time, to put it in an evidential context. The general simplified narrative arising from these and Matty's other data runs as follows. The 5th century witnessed some short-lived continuation of Roman ploughing regimes involving more intensive use of cattle for traction. Then between the 6th and 8th to 9th centuries, most ploughing was light with very little use of mole ball ploughs. They came into more widespread use apparently around the 10th century, and from the 11th century onwards, there is evidence for more specialised plough teams rather than a more generalised use of cattle for traction. It's just a couple more points worth mentioning relating to the draft cattle signature, which Matty has devised based on these osteological criteria. First, Among the regions with the best evidence, there is a higher incidence of the draft castle signature in East Anglia and that central zone, central province, than there is in the southeast, perhaps due at least in part to the generally lighter soils occupied by many of the case study sites in the southeast. Second, incidence is higher at rural and urban sites, broadly defined, than at elite sites, whether secular or ecclesiastical, where such distinctions can be made, heavily caveated observation. So perhaps high-status consumers had little taste for the older, harder work beef, but in any case, we needn't assume that secular and religious estate centres weren't interested in heavy ploughing. After all, the artefactual and historical evidence suggests that they were. Another field of study can be brought to bear on the heavy ploughing question, the study of arable weed ecology, which combines the results of modern botanical survey with archaeobotanical findings from excavated settlements. This work, led by Amy Bogard at Oxford, is based on the observation that different kinds of arable weed thrive in different kinds of cultivation environment. In this case, we've explored how different kinds of weed respond to soil disturbance, essentially whether or not different species can flourish in consistently heavily ploughed fields. To investigate this, we undertook botanical surveys in 2 locations. First at Laxton in Nottinghamshire, the near unique example of a village which has continued open field farming through to the present day. And although they now use modern ploughs and chemicals, the field margins and the unploughed areas between the fields support weed floras that offered a contrast between disturbed and undisturbed soil conditions. To complement this, we undertook a second survey at the organic farm of Highgrove in Gloucestershire for another example of well-disturbed soils, again using mechanised tillage. We expected to find a clear contrast between the disturbed and undisturbed weed floras, not least because certain weed species are already notorious for their persistence in fields and gardens, no matter how hard the farmer or gardener tries to remove them. For instance, these 2 species, couchgrass and creeping thistle, can readily regenerate from their root fragments, so that disturbing the soil can actually give them a competitive advantage. Sure enough, the weed ecology analysis clearly discriminated between areas of low or no disturbance, so fields plotted to the left of the graph, and areas of persistent high disturbance, including ploughed fallow fields, to the right. But of course, these results are from fields tilled with modern tractor-pulled ploughs. So how can we apply this model to medieval data? Well, thanks to the complementary botanical surveys undertaken on the farmland of an experimental replica early medieval farm at Larosam in southern Germany, we can now map onto this analysis how fields tilled with a mulebore plough ought to look on this disturbance spectrum. And these fields, it turns out, fall towards the high disturbance end of the spectrum to the right, but not especially far to the right. On this basis, Amy has derived a baseline, what we have dubbed the Larosam or Lorsch baseline, which is the minimal level of disturbance which we would expect if the mulebore plough were in regular use and had remained in use for some time. We believe that newly cleared farmland would take some time, several years perhaps, before it presented a fully disturbed looking weed flora. These results can now be compared with the archaeological data from a range of sites which have rich archaeobotanical assemblages. As with the national archaeobotanical data set as a whole, there is a distributional bias here. The central zone is very well represented, with far fewer sites in other regions. So we can say that our results from this central area are likely the most representative. So here are some aggregated results from our broad regional groupings, the westerly regions, the easterly regions, and the central zone, with the Lorsch baseline plotted for reference in each case. Each dot represents an archaeobotanical sample, and they're arranged chronologically from the earliest in the 6th century to the left up to the 14th century at the right. And from these results, we infer that mould ball ploughing was practiced in all regions from the 8th century onwards, but not exclusively. Light ploughing was evidently also still practiced right through the period under study. The data do not show any change over time really for the westerly and easterly regions, but for the central zone where we have the most data, a chronological trend is emerging. Heavy ploughing evident in samples at or above the Lorsch baseline appears from the 8th century onwards and is increasingly prevalent over time right through to the 14th century, a pattern which broadly complements the results of Matty's zooarchaeological work, albeit with rather earlier signs of high disturbance. Overall then, we see no tipping point or revolutionary moment in the adoption and spread of the heavy mould ball plough, but rather a steady overall progression towards higher disturbance, above all in the central province, with no apparent reversal, but equally no point at which heavy ploughing is entirely universal. So to the second element in our study, extensive farming. And I should explain that by extensive, we don't simply mean expansive, taking up a lot of acreage, though of course we do mean that as well, but specifically a mode of husbandry which can be characterised as relatively low input. Once again, I'm turning here to Amy's work and her invaluable simplified diagram for distinguishing between these two approaches to increasing productivity, intensification and extensification. For intensification, think garden-style cultivation, a relatively small area of land, but relatively high inputs of labour, for example in weeding, and resources such as manure, per unit area of land. Extensification, by contrast, is exemplified by the idea of great open fields, comparatively large expanses of land with relatively low inputs of labour and manure per unit area. Now, these different strategies for increasing yields result in different kinds of weeds flourishing among the crops. And we know this because earlier studies by Amy and her colleagues have looked at modern fields and the kinds of weeds that grow there, similar to the Laxton and Highgrove surveys that we saw just now, but contrasting extensive and intensive systems. A functional weed ecology approach has successfully distinguished between these two different kinds of weed flora, and the results of this discriminant analysis are shown here, on the same kind of lollipop diagram that we saw earlier. So once again, each stick on the graph represents a single surveyed field, and those that cluster to the left have the extensive floral signature, and those to the right, the intensive flora. And with these modern surveys as a guide, we can look at the species preserved in archaeological samples once again to see where they fall on the spectrum. Here's an example, a fairly typical example of the results from the rural settlement at Stratton, Biggleswade, Bedfordshire, recently published by Archaeopress and reviewed by Chris Dyer in the latest volume of MSR, so do take a look. In this case, each stick represents an archaeological sample of weed seeds. You can see that the only definitively intensive looking samples to the right are a couple marked with black squares, and these date from the 5th to 6th centuries. Everything else, spanning the 7th to 14th and beyond, looks more extensive. So here, extensive cultivation consistent with open field farming was practiced from at least the 7th century onwards, and that is a pattern we see repeated elsewhere. At Lyminge in Kent, the site we've already seen as the source of the earliest known plough coulter, and which was first a royal centre and then a royal monastery, there are no intensive samples at all. Extensive farming characterises the whole assemblage from as early as the 6th century, a pattern which is perhaps consistent with this royal site having been an early adopter of new agricultural techniques, as already suggested by the coulter. In another case study we've done at Stafford in the West Midlands, a fortified settlement which developed into a town, the earliest evidence we have dates to the late 9th century, and from this point onwards, nearly all the samples are again consistent with extensive farming, suggesting that this was the predominant mode of agriculture in that region from at least the late 9th century onwards. if we zoom out from these example case studies and look at the aggregated evidence from all the sites we've studied, we get a similar overall picture. The great majority of samples from throughout the entire period indicate extensive low input farming, with a marked tendency represented by the red dashed line for the plot for the central zone, towards declining fertility over time. You'll notice that the largest graph here represents the central province, which as ever is the region with the richest and therefore arguably most representative data set. But a similar trend may be more cautiously identified in the data from East Anglia and the southeast. The data for Western England represents a shorter time span overall, and no particular chronological trends are evident. So in short, the process of extensification is apparent from around the 8th century onwards and seems to have been a one-way street, but as with heavy ploughing, it never became universal. Now, an interesting complement to this weed-based analysis is provided by the crop stable isotope analyses undertaken by another FeedSax colleague, Liz Stroud. Where charred cereal grains are sufficiently well preserved at a site, it's possible to analyse stable isotopes of nitrogen and carbon in those grains as a proven way to elucidate the growing conditions of crops, because the biochemical composition of the plants is affected by environmental conditions such as moisture and soil fertility. Now, Liz has developed some very sensitive and sophisticated methods for analysing and interpreting her stable isotope data, but I'm not a biochemist, so I'm going to restrict myself to a more straightforward observation here. Enriched nitrogen levels occur frequently at many of our case study sites, including sites across several regions and several periods, and all of the cereal crops in question, so wheat, barley, oats and rye. Examples here include Holmer near Hereford, Houghton in Cambridgeshire, Mildenhall in Suffolk, and Ottery St Mary in Devon. Now, these enriched nitrogen values can't be explained by factors such as salinity or aridity, because that wouldn't match local conditions at any of these sites. And also, the enriched values can't be explained by manuring, because the weed results indicate declining fertility overall. That wouldn't match as an explanation. More plausibly, they could represent seasonal waterlogging on heavier, more water-retentive soils. Hence, these results are very compatible with the increasing use of heavier soils as arable expanded from around the 8th century onwards. So once again, considering both the weeds and the isotopes, we find no big revolutionary moment of change, but rather a long continuous trend towards extensification, probably in some areas including greater use of heavy soils as cultivation expanded and heavy ploughs opened up new terrains for arable farming. And so to the third and final element, crop rotation, and in particular the classic Midland kind of three-course crop rotation, incorporating an autumn sown crop, a spring sown crop and a fallow year. In order to identify this kind of rotation archaeologically, you need to find evidence of two things. Firstly, different crops being systematically associated with different seasons, and secondly, different crops being grown in the same environmental conditions, in other words, in the same fields as each other at a given site, so not just systematic seasons, but in different places. And I should say at the outset that this subject doesn't lend itself so well to the broad sweeping generalizations I've attempted so far, because crop rotation is inherently identifiable at a site-by-site level, not on a regional level. So to the first point, systematic seasonal sowing. This is something that we can explore using the archaeobotanical evidence, the charred cereal remains and the arable weed seeds, which are very often preserved amongst them. And we once again return to our old friend functional weed ecology, because different kinds of arable weed species are associated with autumn sowing and springtime sowing respectively, and it depends chiefly upon their flowering habits. In this case, the lollipop-style discriminant analysis graphs that I've shown several times now are not the best approach. Rather, we want to explore whether and how far different cereal crops tend to be associated with different kinds of arable weed. So we use a different multivariate technique called correspondence analysis, which produces scatter graphs like this. Each symbol represents either a crop or a weed species, and their distribution corresponds to how much they tend to co-occur in a set of archaeobotanical samples. The results shown here are the clearest example we found of a classic champion-style seasonal sowing setup from our case study of Stafford. The graph shows us that the weeds associated with autumn sowing, represented by the yellow stars, correspond more closely with wheat and rye, while the weeds associated with springtime sowing, represented by the red triangles, are more closely aligned with barley. Possibly oats, that's borderline, its position is more debatable, depending on the exact criteria you use. So here we have a clear distinction, at least, between autumn crops and spring crops, a pattern which is consistent with crop rotation, and particularly for the period between the mid-10th and early 13th centuries, where most of these data come from. That hypothesis is reinforced by the crop stable isotope analyses, which brings us back to Liz's work. This example shows results from carbon isotope measurements from that same rich assemblage at Stafford. And it demonstrates that the isotopic differences between the 4 different cereals correspond with what we would expect based on modern controls if they were grown in similar soil conditions. In other words, these results taken together with the weed findings are compatible with crop rotation, though they can't shed any light on the presence or absence of a fallow year. It would be great to have examples like this from across the country, but sadly Stafford is not typical of medieval English archaeobotany. Tend to get more small assemblages with less beautiful preservation. But we've cast our net as wide as possible, and to give one more insight into the topic, I'm going to skim through some wider results of those correspondence analyses. And regrettably, for most of these, it wasn't possible to do complementary isotopic work. Rather than showing you dozens more correspondence analysis graphs, I've summarised the results by classifying sites based on their overall emerging pattern, and the one to watch here is the class I've called champion style, which denotes an assemblage that appears to contain autumn sown wheat and or rye, and spring sown barley and or oats. These are the yellow stars on the map, and they are only a minority of sites. Chronologically, and we're here looking at the yellow bars specifically, which represent the time frames of each site assemblage, they mostly span the later 9th to 13th centuries, but with the precocious ecclesiastical settlement at Ely showing this champion pattern potentially as early as the 7th century. As with Lyminge and its 7th century quarter, do we here have another monastic early adopter of a new approach? And you look at the other sites in this same box, you have the Royal Burr, Stafford, Perceived Royal Tribute Collection Centre, Higham Ferrers, a medieval manor at Westcotton, and the 10th century estate centre at Bishopston. So there are growing hints that elite settlements of some kind were clearly involved in agricultural development, whether or not they were spearheading innovations in any special way. I could say plenty more if there were time, but the better option would be for you to read the latest publication, which is available free online and to buy as a paperback. It's a set of conference proceedings with papers by most of the FeedSax team, as well as colleagues in related fields. It would take me all day to acknowledge everyone who's helped FeedSax by giving us access to data or materials or advice and information, generally supporting us. But one slide will have to suffice, and I'll apologise to the many people whose names aren't on there. We appreciate everyone nonetheless. And thank you for listening.